A racist gang attacks a black woman in the park, confident that fear will make her submit. But they have no idea she's a Navy SEAL, with a will of steel and combat skills beyond their imagination. In the darkness of hatred, a spark of justice ignites, leading to consequences no one could have predicted. What happens when the attackers discover the truth about this woman? This story will make you reflect on courage, justice, and the unstoppable power of the human spirit. Stay tuned, because what comes next will leave you speechless. The story begins. The sunlight bathed the park in a soft golden hue, casting long shadows from the ancient trees onto the winding pathways. The laughter of a group of children playing on the swings echoed from afar, mingling with the chirping of birds perched in the branches. On a bench near the small pond, Lauren Tate sat in silence, savoring the rare quiet moment of the afternoon. Her black leather jacket rested beside her, revealing a muscular frame under a simple gray t-shirt and jeans. A faint scar on her forearm, only visible in the sunlight, was the sole trace of a life shaped by distant battles. She observed her surroundings not out of suspicion, but out of habit. A jogger passed by, giving a brief nod, and she returned the gesture with a slight smile. Years of service in the Navy SEALs had honed her instincts, and though she'd long since left active duty, she couldn't stop noticing the small details. A man walked by a few steps away, and a group of youths huddled near the playground. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but the air felt off. Not far off, for men lingered near the base of an old oak tree. Their laughter was sharp, filled with hostility, slicing through the serene atmosphere like a blade. The leader, a tall man with broad shoulders, dressed in a black hoodie, leaned against the tree, scanning the area like a predator. Tyrell Hayes was no stranger to conflict. His shaved head glistened under the sun, and a faded tattoo ran up his neck, marking a life lived on the fringes. He nudged the man beside him, a scruffy bearded guy, and pointed at Lauren. "That's her," Tyrell murmured, his voice low but dripping with disdain. "Sitting there acting like she owns the place. Easy pickings." The scruffy man chuckled, cracking his knuckles, then added, "Let's see if she fights back, huh?" Tyrell's lips curled into a smirk. "Try it, they're all the same." Lauren felt their gaze before she saw them. A shiver ran down her spine, her body tensing ever so slightly. Slowly, she turned her head, their eyes meeting for a brief moment. They didn't look away. That was the first sign that they were a threat. She maintained a relaxed posture, one hand draped over the back of the bench, the other resting on her thigh, breathing evenly. But in her mind, everything was being assessed. 4 men, the leader with broad shoulders, the second with a wiry frame, the other 2 younger, barely in their 20s, standing with crossed arms, brimming with overconfidence. A faint scent of cheap cologne and cigarette smoke wafted in the air, confirming their proximity. "You guys got something interesting going on?" Lauren muttered, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Let's see." The group of men began to move, their conversation growing louder as they advanced toward her. Their laughter echoed across the playground, drawing the attention of a few passers-by, but they quickly turned away, not wanting to get involved. Tyrell stepped closer, his heavy footsteps deliberate. The scruffy man and the 2 younger guys flanked him like wolves circling their prey. Lauren didn't flinch. Instead, she adjusted her posture, making herself appear more vulnerable, luring them in. Her instincts told her this group was used to preying on easy targets, relying on fear to strike. They had no idea who she really was. Tyrell stopped just beside the walkway, right next to Lauren's bench, his shoes crunching on the gravel, the sound loud in the silence. His grin widened, revealing yellowed teeth from cheap cigarettes and coffee. Behind him, the scruffy man giggled, while the 2 younger men exchanged excited glances, unable to contain themselves. They spread out slightly, forming a loose circle around Lauren's seat. "Lovely afternoon, ma'am," Tyrell said, his voice slick with sarcasm. "Perfect day to sit here all alone, huh?" Lauren slowly lifted her head, her gaze steady, her eyes narrowing just enough to show she wasn't afraid. "What do you want?" she replied flatly. Tyrell sneered, glancing at his crew as if Lauren had just cracked a joke. "Well, that's not how you greet people who want to chat. Got a problem with these fine gentlemen trying to say hello?" The scruffy man moved closer, his grin revealing yellow teeth. Or maybe you think you're too special to talk to us? Lauren didn't answer. Her eyes scanned each man, assessing their stances, calculating their proximity. They were too close for comfort, almost within range for an unexpected move to spark the confrontation she knew was about to happen. You hear me, lady? The scruffy man's voice sharpened suddenly. You think you're better than us? One of the younger men, his face flushed from the sun, sneered. She's probably one of those types, thinks she owns this park like it belongs to people like her. Lauren clenched her jaw, but her voice remained steady. I don't think anything here belongs to me. I'm just sitting here living my life. Got it, boys, Tyrell sneered, his tone mocking. She's just living her life. Guess we'll live it for her then. He pointed at the bag beside Lauren. Nice bag. Bet there's something interesting in there. How about a little courtesy, huh? Hand it over to us. We don't want things to get messy. A faint, almost imperceptible smile tugged at Lauren's lips. Is that what you call courtesy? Stealing from people like me? Tyrell's face darkened, his fake smile vanishing for a moment. What do you mean by that? You know exactly what I mean, Lauren replied, her voice cold. You didn't choose me because I'm sitting alone. You chose me because you think I'm an easy target. The younger man stepped forward, his voice growing angry. You've got a lot to say, huh? Maybe you're the type to whine about racism whenever things don't go your way. Lauren slowly stood up, every movement deliberate. The shift in height gave her a presence they hadn't anticipated. She was shorter than Tyrell, but there was a quiet authority in her posture, one forged through challenges far more demanding than the one before her. Her unwavering gaze unsettled them, though none of them would admit it. You really think this is going to go according to your plan? She said, her tone calm, yet every word felt like a challenge. Walk away if you still can. The man with the stubble laughed loudly, but there was a trace of nervousness in his laughter. Look at her, trying to act tough. What are you gonna do? Call the cops? You think they'll come save you? Both of the younger men joined in the mocking laughter, and with the strange camaraderie of their group, Tyrell moved closer. His eyes narrowed, no longer playful. The atmosphere grew thick with unspoken tension, and Lauren could feel the shift. This was the decisive moment. I don't think you're listening, lady, Tyrell said, his voice low and hostile. We're taking that bag and we might take something else too. Lauren's pulse quickened, not out of fear, but in anticipation of what was about to happen. The instincts of a seal surged within her. She analyzed every angle, every possible escape, every weak point in their formation. The lessons from years of grueling training flooded back. Stay calm, control the situation, hit hard, and don't stop until the threat is neutralized. But she waited. They hadn't made their move yet, and she needed to be sure this threat was real. Her hands seemed relaxed at her sides, but in reality, they were ready for action. Tyrell leaned in, his voice dropping to a growl. This isn't a game, lady. Hand over the bag, or we'll show you what happens when you don't respect someone who's above you. Lauren met his gaze, her voice like steel. You'll regret this. She gripped the strap of her bag, standing up with tension in her body, but her face remained calm. The men looked at her with mocking, contemptuous stares, waiting for her to react in fear. She adjusted the strap over her shoulder, keeping her tone steady as she said, I've got places to be. Without waiting for a response, she turned and started walking. Her steps were firm, her breathing steady, though her heart was pounding faster. She had no intention of running. She knew that would only inflate their arrogance. But she wasn't going to stand there and give them the satisfaction of seeing her fear. Behind her, the mocking laughter grew louder, like a pack of hyenas circling their prey. Hey, where are you going? One of the younger men sneered. We're not done with you yet, lady. Lauren didn't acknowledge them, her pace steady, her mind quickly calculating her options. The main path of the park lay ahead, but the tree-lined path beside her suddenly felt too quiet, too distant from the safety of the crowd. The sound of footsteps on gravel grew louder, closing in. She clenched her jaw. Come on, don't do this. The man with the stubble called out, laughing. You're not used to people like us, huh? Talk to us, or are you too good for that? Lauren gritted her teeth, forcing herself not to look back. She turned a corner and stopped abruptly when she realized her mistake. Ahead was an open area, but they were moving faster than she thought. They had blocked her path, forming a loose semicircle around her. Tyrell stood in the middle, his broad shoulders squared, a mocking smile stretching across his face, daring her to make a move. The man with the stubble stood beside him, scratching his arm, while the two younger men leaned against the trees, as if they had all the time in the world. Now what? Tyrell said, his voice laced with sarcastic politeness. Look at you stuck now. Bet you didn't think this would happen, did you? Lauren glanced over her shoulder, but one of the young men had already circled behind her, blocking her escape. She was surrounded. Her eyes scanned each of them, reading their movements, their stances. Her body was calm, but her mind was calculating rapidly. There was no reasoning with people like them, not with their kind. Tyrell took a step forward, his smile widening, quickly turning into something far more sinister. You're done, little girl. This isn't your neighborhood. Lauren met his gaze, her voice cold but resolute. I'm not lost. If you step aside, I'll leave. The man with the patchy beard sneered and moved closer. You think you can just walk away? We're not letting you go anywhere. Tyrell smirked. You don't get it. You're not like us. She didn't respond, keeping her composure, her gaze sharp and unwavering. One of the young men pushed off from a tree, pointing at Lauren. She thinks she's better than us, see? Looks at us like we're beneath her. Probably the type to cry about racism whenever things don't go her way. Exactly. The man with the beard added, his voice more cutting now. She probably lived her whole life in comfort, never had to work a day to earn a dime. It's a pity story. Lauren took a deep breath, her patience running thin. You don't know a thing about me. Tyrell grinned wider, his smile dripping with disdain. I know enough. You're like the rest, always looking for help, always expecting others to step aside. But not today. Lauren subtly adjusted her posture, her eyes still calm and piercing. She hadn't changed her expression, but every movement of hers was an unspoken challenge. You've been warned, she said firmly. Move, and this ends here. The man with the patchy beard laughed, throwing his head back. Listen to her, Tyrell. She thinks she's in charge here? She's got no control, old woman. Tyrell growled, his voice dropping to a low, threatening tone. You'll give me that bag and maybe, just maybe, I'll let you leave without a mark. Lauren's eyes swept across the men's faces. Her instincts had kicked in. They weren't here for the bag. This was just an excuse. This was a power play. They wanted to break her, to make her feel weak. They wanted her to submit, to give them a show. She stood firm, her voice steady and cutting. You've had your chance. No sooner had she spoken, one of the young men lunged forward. Lauren smoothly sidestepped, her movements swift and precise. She didn't strike it. A soldier's instinct guided her to act quickly and decisively, but she needed them to cross the line completely. Tyrell's face twisted with fury as he shouted, What are you waiting for? Grab her! Before Tyrell's command was even finished, the young man lunged again, this time with more force. Lauren stepped aside again, grabbed his arm in a smooth motion, using his momentum to spin him around and throw him to the ground. He screamed, clutching his arm as he rolled away, temporarily out of the fight. The men paused. For a moment, their faces shifting from cocky confidence to disbelief. Lauren turned her gaze to the others, her stance calm yet unyielding. She adjusted the strap of her bag over her shoulder, her eyes narrowing. I told you to leave. The man with the patchy beard sneered, though his body showed some hesitation now. Who do you think you are, old woman? Tyrell took a step forward, his imposing figure casting a shadow over her. You think you're strong? We'll see how long that lasts. He swung a wide punch, clumsy and uncontrolled, aiming to overwhelm rather than hit. Lauren easily ducked, her movements smooth and practiced. As she rose, she drove her elbow into his side, forcing him to stagger back, gasping for breath, clutching his ribs in pain and fury. All of you, get in here. Tyrell snarled, signaling the others. Lauren felt her muscles tense as the remaining men closed in. The bearded man took the first swing, his fist flying at her with wild, uncoordinated fury. She blocked his punch with flawless precision, every move calculated. A powerful kick to his knee sent him stumbling, his balance lost long enough for Lauren to push him. But he hit the ground with a heavy thud, cursing under his breath. The young man who had previously been leaning against the tree lunged at her once again. This time he was more cautious, but just as aggressive. Lauren met his attack head-on, blocking his punch and pushing her hand into his chest. The force of the impact caused him to stagger back, gasping for breath, though he remained standing, his face flushed with tension. "You'll pay for this," he snarled, circling her, eyes full of hatred. Lauren did not respond, her gaze fixed on him, her body poised for action. She could feel the surge of adrenaline flooding her system, her mind sharp. This was not just a fight, this was survival. Tyrell had recovered and advanced again, this time moving slower, but each motion calculated. "You think you're a hero?" he spat, voice dripping with contempt. "You think you can walk into our turf and humiliate us?" Lauren turned fully towards him, her voice calm but unwavering. "This isn't your turf, and I'm not here to humiliate anyone. You've already done that to yourselves." Her words only enraged him further. He feigned a left punch before throwing. A real one aimed directly at her head. Lauren ducked, avoiding the blow, and countered quickly, delivering a hard strike to his stomach followed by a low kick to his shin. Tyrell staggered but stayed on his feet. He swung again, but this time, his attack was fueled by frustration rather than strategy. Lauren effortlessly sidestepped his punch, forcing him off balance as she stepped aside. "Come on, Tyrell," the bearded man shouted, struggling to his feet, his voice full of frustration. "Stop playing around." Lauren briefly glanced toward her periphery and intercepted an attack from one of the younger men. He had grabbed a branch and swung it like a baseball bat, but Lauren swiftly closed the gap, spinning and disarming him in one smooth motion. A powerful shove sent him stumbling backward, tripping over his own feet and falling to the gravel path. Tyrell let out a furious roar and charged at her with every ounce of strength left. This time, Lauren allowed him to get closer, right up to her before she gently leaned to the side, using his own momentum to shove him into a nearby tree. The impact sent him reeling, and he grabbed the tree trunk to steady himself. The bearded man, emboldened by Tyrell's distraction, lunged from behind. Lauren sensed his approach, pivoting just in time to catch him mid-attack. She drove her elbow into his chest and shoved him forcefully, sending him crashing to the ground. The chaos of the fight raged on, but every move Lauren made was deliberate and precise, reflecting her training. Still, she couldn't avoid every blow. Her ribs ached from a punch she couldn't fully block, and her arm throbbed from where the young man's branch had scraped across it. But she pushed through the pain, keeping her focus sharp. Tyrell staggered back to his feet, his face twisted in fury. "You think it's over?" he hissed through gritted teeth, his voice seething with rage and desperation. "You'll regret this, you old bitch. You'll regret messing with us." Lauren straightened, her breath steady despite the exhaustion, her tone cold. "No," she said firmly. "You're the one who'll regret it." The remaining men, bruised and battered, exchanged doubtful glances. The bearded man slowly got to his feet, his confidence visibly shaken. Another young man backed away, muttering something about it not being worth continuing, but Tyrell refused to back down. His pride and ego wouldn't allow him to retreat. "You think you've won?" he spat. "You have no idea what you've started." Lauren narrowed her eyes, her voice calm but resolute. "Then let's finish it." But before any of them could make a move, a distant sound shattered the tense atmosphere. The faint wail of a police siren echoed in the distance, and the change in the men's expressions was immediate. Tyrell squinted, his mind racing, calculating whether his pride was worth the risk of being caught. "The cops are coming," one of the young men muttered, stepping back, glancing quickly toward the horizon. "They're almost here." Tyrell screamed, his voice rising in fury. "This isn't over. We're not done." The bearded man hesitated, swaying on his feet, his gaze flickering between Tyrell and the others. "Forget it, man. This isn't worth it. Shut up, Tyrell roared, pointing at him. We don't run. We finish this. Lauren stood firm, her breath steady despite the lingering ache in her body. She sensed the fracture in their unity, the cracks in the wall of arrogance that had once given them their confidence. The police sirens grew louder, an imminent promise of intervention that they couldn't ignore. She's not worth it, the young man said again, his voice tinged with concern. Let's go. Tyrell turned to look at Lauren, his eyes seething with both fury and disappointment. He took another step forward, his hands clenched, fingers trembling. For a moment, it seemed as though he would press on, consequences be damned. But then, the sound of police sirens sliced through the tense air, growing louder with each passing second. The flashing red and blue lights flickered through the gaps in the trees. Damn it, Tyrell cursed, his voice breaking with anger. He shot Lauren a glare filled with venom before turning on his heel. This isn't over. Lauren responded coldly, her voice steady. Yes, it is. With a growl of frustration, Tyrell spun around and gestured for the others to follow. Let's go quickly. The man with the sparse beard hesitated for only a moment before limping after Tyrell, his expression grim. The young men exchanged one last look with Lauren, their faces a mixture of anger and uncertainty. Then, one by one, they silently followed their leader. One of them muttered under his breath as he passed, "She's really crazy," before disappearing into the shadows of the woods. Lauren stood firm, her body tense with alertness. Her ears strained to catch the fading sounds of footsteps, until the only noise left was the wind whispering through the trees and the deep silence of the night. Her eyes scanned the surroundings carefully, ensuring that no one was coming back. Only when she was certain they had left did she exhale a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The sirens were now unmistakably close, the sound of tires scraping over gravel signaling the approach of law enforcement. 2 patrol cars pulled up to the edge of the park, their lights dancing on the trunks of the trees. Officers stepped out cautiously, hands resting on their belts, eyes scanning the situation. One of them, a tall man with an authoritative voice, approached Lauren. "Ma'am, are you all right? We received a call about a disturbance in the park." Lauren nodded, her tone calm. Fine, they've gone." The officer's gaze lingered on her, his attention briefly drawn to the scratch on her arm and the subtle shift in her posture that betrayed the pain she was trying to mask. "Did they hurt you?" Lauren shook her head. "Nothing I can't handle." Another officer scanned the area, taking note of the disarray, the trampled earth, the discarded items, one of the young men's hats, a stick left behind. He turned back to his colleague. "Looks like they made a quick exit." The first officer sighed and pulled out his notebook. "Can you describe them?" Lauren hesitated for a moment, her mind still reeling from the events. She could feel the adrenaline beginning to fade, replaced by the dull ache of bruises and cuts on her arm. 4 of them around 19 years old. Their leader is tall, shaved head, with a tattoo on his neck. Goes by Tyrell. The officer nodded, jotting down notes. "Did they say anything? Any reason they chose you?" Lauren's jaw tightened. She could still hear their voices echoing in her mind, mocking tones, insults, the hatred buried beneath their bravado. She chose her words carefully. This wasn't random. They knew exactly what they were doing. The officer paused, his pen hovering over the page. "What do you mean?" "Lauren met his gaze, unwavering. I mean, they've done this before, and they'll do it again." The officer's expression hardened as he continued writing. "We'll keep an eye on them. In the meantime, we need you to come down to the station to file an official report." Lauren nodded slowly. "I'll head there." As the officers returned to their cars, Lauren stayed where she was for a moment, grounding herself. The area had fallen silent again, but the weight of what had just transpired still hung in the air. This wasn't over. Tyrell's threat wasn't just a warning, it was a challenge, and Lauren wasn't backing down. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed above her as she sat down across from Officer Carter. Her expression remained calm, though her body still hummed with the remnants of adrenaline. The confrontation in the park had ended, but the men's words still lingered. Their hatred was unmistakable. Carter, a young officer with a serious demeanor, opened his notebook. Let's start from the beginning, Miss Tate. You said there were 4 of them, and the leader called himself Tyrell. Can you describe exactly what happened? Lauren recounted the events with precision and detail. Tyrell's tone, the insults, the way they had surrounded her like wolves. Carter's pen moved swiftly across the page, his expression growing more intense as her story unfolded. When she finished, he tapped the pen against the notebook, lost in thought. It doesn't sound like a random incident. Are you sure you've never encountered these people before? I'm certain, Lauren replied. They weren't after my purse. That was just an excuse. They saw me sitting alone and thought they could intimidate me. They wanted me to feel like I didn't belong here. Carter furrowed his brow and leaned back in his chair. Why do you think they chose you? Lauren didn't hesitate. Because I'm black. Carter's pen hovered in midair. He looked at Lauren intently. Did they say that? Lauren clenched her jaw. Not directly, but it was clear in everything they did. They made it clear to me, those remarks about me, assuming I thought I was better than them, that people like me don't belong here. This wasn't just about theft, they wanted me to feel inferior. Carter sighed, snapping his notebook shut with a soft click. We've had reports of similar harassment recently, mostly minor incidents in public spaces. But if this group is targeting people based on race... His voice trailed off, the frustration clear on his face. They are that group, Lauren said firmly. And they've been doing this for a while. They're too confident, too comfortable. This isn't their first time. Carter leaned forward, his brow furrowed. I'll search for information on them in the system and cross-reference with recent reports, but I have to be honest with you, Miss Tate. Cases like these are difficult to resolve. If victims don't file complaints or there's no solid evidence, building a case is almost impossible. Lauren's tone sharpened. Then find the evidence, because I'm not letting this go. A few hours later, Lauren sat in her living room, the dim glow from her laptop casting shadows as she scrolled through local news stories. She wasn't the type to sit and wait for things to happen. Military training had taught her to be proactive, and if Carter needed more evidence, she would find it. It didn't take long for her to recognize a troubling pattern. Over the past 6 months, there had been multiple reports of harassment and minor assaults in the area, all linked to groups of men targeting individuals in public spaces. In each incident, the victims were people of color. Lauren's jaw tightened as she read through the reports. The descriptions of the attackers were strikingly consistent. A tall man with broad shoulders, tattoos on his neck, accompanied by younger men, Tyrell. Many of the victims hadn't filed complaints, possibly out of fear or frustration with the system, but their reports echoed the same message. These attacks weren't about stealing. They were about sending a message. As she dug deeper, Lauren found a community forum discussing similar incidents. A prominent thread read, "These guys aren't just random thugs. They're targeting minorities. They pick the right moments, intimidate, and quickly retreat. No one's been able to catch them." Her phone suddenly buzzed on the table, cutting through her focus. It was a message from Emily Carter, her best friend and a journalist known for pursuing stories that others avoided. "I heard about what happened. Are you okay? Call me." Without hesitation, Lauren dialed her number, and Emily picked up on the first ring. "Lauren, I saw the news." "What happened?" Lauren recounted everything, the assault, the insults, and the patterns she had discovered. Emily was silent for a moment before speaking, her voice heavy. "It sounds like this isn't just a gang of thugs. If they're organized like that and targeting minorities, it could be a hate group." "Exactly," Lauren replied. "And I'm not letting them get away with it." Emily sighed. "I get it, but these people are dangerous, Lauren. If you dig too deep, they'll come after you. They came after me because they thought I would back down." Lauren interrupted. "There's no way I'm letting that happen. They're wrong." A pause lingered before Emily spoke again, her voice tired but supportive. "Do you need anything? Any info at all?" Lauren replied immediately. Where they're gathering, how long they've been doing this, why the police can't stop them, anything. Emily hesitated for a moment. "I'll look into it, but promise me you'll be careful." These people don't like being exposed. Lauren didn't answer immediately. She stared at the laptop screen, Tyrell's face and his accomplices burned into her memory. Finally, she spoke, her voice resolute. I'll be careful, but this has to stop. When the call ended, Lauren leaned back in her chair, her body still sore from the fight, but the pain only strengthened her resolve. These people thought they could scare her into silence, thought they could get away with it. They were wrong. The next morning, Lauren sat at the kitchen table, cradling a steaming mug of black coffee. Her laptop sat open in front of her, the quiet sounds of the neighborhood creeping through the window, children playing, dogs barking, the distant hum of lawnmowers. It was a stark contrast to the darkness she had sifted through online. Emily had sent her a series of links and documents related to Tyrell and his group. These pieces of evidence painted a clearer picture of their activities and connections. This wasn't just a gang of hooligans harassing people in the park, they were part of a larger, loose network operating under the radar, targeting minority communities in small but calculated ways. Lauren scrolled through the files again, her jaw tightening. These incidents were no accident. They were coordinated attacks, property vandalism, and intimidation tactics designed to instill fear in specific communities. And there were rumors of a figure above Tyrell, someone possibly pulling the strings and keeping his group in check. Her phone buzzed suddenly, snapping her out of her focus. It was a call from Officer Carter. "Tate," she answered sharply. "Good morning." Carter's voice crackled with tension, as though he hadn't had enough sleep. "I've looked into the names you gave me. You're right, Tyrell's not some nobody. He's tied to a series of reported incidents, and his group has been causing trouble for months." "I already knew that," Lauren replied. "So what are you doing about it?" "That's the issue," Carter admitted. "Most of the victims haven't filed complaints, so there's no paper trail. It's hard to legally connect the dots." "Then make a paper trail," Lauren snapped. "If I can dig up this much information in a few hours, you have the resources to dig deeper. Don't tell me your hands are tied." Carter sighed heavily. "Look, I want to take this group down as much as you do, but without solid evidence, any action we take could fall apart in court. If they walk, it's over." Lauren clenched her teeth. She hated the bureaucratic system, the endless hoops while people like Tyrell continued to run unchecked. "So what's your plan?" she asked. Carter hesitated. "There's a rumor at the station that Tyrell's group might be connected to a larger organization. We're talking about hate crimes, maybe even domestic terrorism. If that's the case, the feds could get involved." Lauren leaned forward, her gaze steely. "So that means we need something concrete before we can push it higher?" "We're working on it," Carter said. "But it'll take time." Lauren's lips pressed into a thin line. Time was not something she was willing to give to people like Tyrell. "I'll do my part," she said finally. "But you better be ready when I bring you something." Carter sighed again. "Don't do anything stupid, Tate." She hung up without responding. That afternoon, Lauren found herself sitting in an unassuming cafe in another part of town, facing Emily. Her journalist friend looked tired but determined. Her laptop was open beside her as she flipped through notes. "This is bigger than we thought," Emily said, pushing a stack of files across the table. "Tyrell's group is just one part of the picture. There are at least 3 other groups like them operating in the area, each with their own name, their own tactics, but all with the same goal, intimidation." Lauren flipped through the stack of documents, her face tightening with each page. Photos of graffiti, mugshots of other group members, maps with red circles marking incidents. It was all part of a coordinated effort to spread fear and control the community. "This isn't just harassment," Lauren whispered. "They're trying to push people out, make them feel unsafe in their own neighborhoods." Emily nodded, her expression grim. "And they've gotten away with it because these incidents are too small to catch national attention. No one's connecting the dots." In Lauren's mind, the pieces began to fall into place, each one more dangerous than the last. If they could figure out who was behind Tyrell, they could dismantle the entire network. "What about the funding?" Lauren asked. "It can't just be a few angry men with too much time on their hands. Someone's funding them." "That's the hard part," Emily said. "There are rumors of donations from private organizations, possibly from certain groups, but nothing solid yet. Lauren leaned back, crossing her arms. We'll target Tyrell first. He's the weakest link. If we can take him down, he might lead us to whoever is running this operation, Emily said, her eyes uncertain as they met Lauren's. That's too risky. You know he won't be easy to break, Emily added. Lauren's brow furrowed, her gaze hardening. Then we'll force him. If Carter isn't decisive enough, I will be. Emily opened her mouth to protest, but Lauren raised a hand to silence her. I know exactly what I'm doing. I didn't survive what I've been through just to let scum like him win. This ends now. Emily looked at her, the concern in her eyes softening. Just promise me you'll be careful. Lauren didn't look away. Careful won't win this war. As Lauren stepped out of the cafe, her mind focused with singular intensity. Tyrell had slipped through her grasp once, but she wouldn't let it happen again. He was the key to unraveling the entire operation, and she would bring him down, no matter the cost. She moved through the city's shadows like a ghost, her presence undetected. The distant hum of traffic provided a steady backdrop as she approached the rundown bar Emily had pointed out in her research. Tyrell and his crew frequented this place, a shady dive, dimly lit, on the city's edge, where the air was thick with cigarette smoke and ill intentions. Lauren paused just before the door, blending into the darkness, her eyes scanning the area carefully. Two men stood near the entrance, talking lazily. Their voices were low, but their body language was defensive. They didn't dress like Tyrell's crew, but Lauren knew better than to trust appearances. She adjusted her hat, pulling it lower to obscure her face, and slipped inside, careful not to draw attention. The bar was a dim, oppressive space, the kind of place where people came to disappear. Lauren's eyes flicked to every corner of the room as the light dimmed. Further, she quickly spotted a familiar face, a scruffy bearded man sitting in a corner with one of the younger thugs from the park. They were deep in conversation, oblivious to her as she made her way toward the bar. The bartender, a gaunt man with a face like weathered leather, looked up as she approached. What do you want? He asked. Information, Lauren replied softly, sliding a $20 bill across the counter. I'm looking for someone. A big guy, shaved head, covered in tattoos, goes by Tyrell. The bartender's expression didn't change, but his eyes briefly flicked toward the table where the bearded man sat. Never heard of him, the bartender said. Lauren placed another bill on the counter. Are you sure? He hesitated, then glanced back at the table before leaning in and whispering, they were here earlier, then left in a hurry when they heard the cops were looking for him. I heard something about a warehouse on Fletcher Street. That's all I know. Lauren nodded, adding another bill as a tip. Thanks. She left the bar as quietly as she'd entered, her mind already forming possibilities. Fletcher Street lay in the industrial part of town, a maze of abandoned warehouses and forgotten factories. If Tyrell was hiding there, finding him wouldn't be easy, but it meant he was out of options. An hour later, Lauren crouched behind a stack of rusted containers, her eyes fixed on a warehouse bathed in dim light. The area was quiet, but she could make out movement through broken windows. Shadows shifted silently in the eerie glow of a single overhead light. Her instincts told her this was the place. Tyrell's crew wasn't large enough to maintain tight security, but Lauren knew she couldn't expect an unguarded hideout. She swept her eyes over the area, her SEAL training guiding her step by step, assessing potential entry points and threats. Two figures stood near the main door, tense. One of them was smoking, the red glow of the cigarette briefly lighting up his face. Lauren recognized him as one of the younger thugs from the park. The other man was unfamiliar, but his build suggested he wasn't someone to be underestimated. Lauren took steady breaths as she considered her next move. She needed to get inside without drawing attention, but she also needed leverage. If Tyrell was here, he wouldn't give up any information easily. Without a reason, she moved around the side of the warehouse, finding a broken window, partially obscured by overgrown bushes. She tested the window frame carefully, grimacing as it creaked slightly under her touch. Slipping inside, she landed silently on the concrete floor, crouching low to survey her surroundings. The warehouse was as dilapidated as she'd imagined, walls stained with grime, the air thick with the scent of oil and decay. Faint, strange whispers reached her ears, and she moved toward the sound, staying in the shadows. Tyrell's voice was unmistakable, deep and commanding, even in a whisper. "I told you to stay put until this blows over. No more action until I say so." The bearded man's voice was smaller, tinged with frustration. "You act like we can just sit still. People are starting to ask questions." "Let them ask," Tyrell snapped. "We stay put until I say otherwise. Discussion's over." Lauren quietly inched closer, her footsteps silent on the concrete floor. From her position behind a stack of crates, she could see Tyrell standing near a makeshift table, his large frame lit by the dim light. The bearded man and another figure sat nearby, tense, while a few others lurked. In the shadows, their faces blurred but their presence undeniable. She needed a way to lure Tyrell out, a reason to force him to act without putting herself in immediate danger. Taking out her phone, she quickly messaged Emily. "Found him. Warehouse on Fletcher. Call Carter now." After sending the message, she adjusted her posture, preparing for the next move. She wouldn't leave without answers, but she wasn't reckless enough to confront Tyrell and his crew alone. The sirens had bought her some time at the park, but this time, she knew she needed more than luck to win. "Tyrell," Lauren's voice cut through the tense silence. All eyes turned to her, no one reacting fast enough. Tyrell's gaze narrowed as he stepped forward, his face darkening in recognition. "You?" he growled, his voice low and heavy. Lauren stood tall, her expression calm but her eyes sharp. "We need to talk." Tyrell sneered, his voice a low threat. "You think you can just walk in here and start making demands?" Lauren's voice was as cold as steel. "I think you're going to tell me everything I want to know. If not, this place will be crawling with cops in under 3 minutes. Tyrell's smile faltered, but only for a brief moment before his confidence returned. "You don't scare me." Lauren took a step closer, unwavering. "You should." Tyrell's men exchanged worried glances, the bravado from before slowly fading as Lauren closed the distance. Her calm and resolute presence filled the room, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. "You've got guts," Tyrell said, his voice tense as he tried to maintain control. "But guts don't mean much when you're outnumbered." Lauren's piercing gaze swept over the room, counting the people, 5 in total, including Tyrell. Her face remained unchanged. "Outnumbered? I've been in worse situations, and guess what? They didn't win either." Tyrell clenched his fists, grinding his teeth. "Big talk. You think you're some kind of hero?" Lauren's response was cold. "No, I'm just the one who's going to make sure you pay for what you've done." Before Tyrell could respond, the sound of distant sirens echoed through the night. The noise grew louder, red and blue lights flashing, casting moving shadows on the stained walls. Tyrell froze, the smile fading from his face, replaced by genuine concern. "You called the cops?" the bearded man yelled, his voice cracking in panic. He glanced toward the door, instinctively knowing it was time to run. Lauren's voice was as sharp as ever. "You think I came here without a plan? It's over." "Don't let her scare you," Tyrell shouted, his voice weakening as his own uncertainty took hold. "We've been through worse than this." "You've been through worse?" Lauren stepped forward. "Because from where I stand, you're about to lose everything." The sound of tires crunching on gravel outside echoed, followed by the slamming of car doors and muffled voices of approaching officers. Tyrell's crew exchanged nervous glances, waiting for his orders, but even he looked uncertain, unsure of what to do next. "Tyrell, what do we do now?" a young thug whispered, panic in his voice. Tyrell turned to him, his face contorting in anger. "Shut up and stay still. We're not running." Lauren's voice cut through the rising chaos. "You're not running, but you will face the consequences." The bearded man, finally losing his nerve, bolted toward the back door. Lauren moved like lightning, blocking him before he could reach it. Grabbing his arm, she twisted it behind his back with precision honed by years of training, forcing him to his knees. He yelped, the cocky attitude gone, replaced by frantic fear. Not going anywhere, Lauren said evenly, her grip firm. Tyrell and his crew stood frozen, their hesitation allowing the police outside to make their move. The main door suddenly swung open, a squad of uniformed officers storming in, weapons drawn, but their voices still commanding. "Hands up," one of the officers barked. Tyrell's face twisted with rage, but reluctantly he raised his hands. His men followed suit, fear outweighing their loyalty to their leader. Within moments, the officers closed in, cuffing them all. Lauren released the man with the sparse beard, stepping back as another officer took over. She stood tall, her gaze sharp as she watched Tyrell being cuffed and pulled to his feet. "Do you think this changes anything?" Tyrell growled, his eyes still defiant. Lauren moved closer, her voice low enough only he could hear. "It's over. The people you've hurt, the fear you've instilled, it all ends here. And if there's anyone above you, I'll find them too." Tyrell's glare was filled with venom, his earlier confidence now just a hollow shell. The officers led him and his crew out of the warehouse, their voices fading as they were escorted to the patrol cars. Carter approached Lauren, his expression a mix of relief and respect. "You weren't kidding when you said you'd bring something concrete." Lauren crossed her arms, her stance unwavering. "You've got them. Don't let this slip." Carter nodded. "We'll hold them tight. You've done more than enough, Tate." Lauren didn't respond immediately, her eyes still fixed on the warehouse. The echoes of the confrontation still lingered in her mind. Finally, she spoke. "This isn't over. Tyrell is just a piece of the puzzle. There's someone bigger pulling the strings, and I'll find them." Carter furrowed his brow. "We'll do our best, but don't go it alone. You've done enough." Lauren gave him a cold smile. "We both know I don't stop halfway." As the officers finished their work, Lauren turned and walked away. The cool night breeze brushed against her face. Tyrell and his crew were arrested, but the fight wasn't over. This was only the beginning, and she was ready for what came next. The dim light from her laptop screen cast a glow on her face as Lauren leaned forward, her fingers swiftly moving across the keyboard. It was well past midnight, but the rush from capturing Tyrell still surged through her. The warehouse takedown had given her and the police a solid victory, but she knew it was just a piece of a bigger picture. Tyrell's operation wasn't an isolated one. It was part of a larger network, and she needed to know who was behind it all. Across from her, Emily sat cross-legged on the couch, her eyes skimming through documents on her tablet. She wasn't as sharp as usual, her eyes tired, but the determination in her gaze still matched Lauren's. "Carter confirmed they're holding Tyrell temporarily," Emily said, her voice hoarse. "But unless they have concrete evidence to charge him, he'll hire a lawyer and be released." "He won't get away," Lauren said confidently. "Not if we prove he's tied to a larger network." Emily frowned, her hand halting in the middle of a document. "It won't be easy. These groups are careful, keeping their activities dispersed so no one knows the full picture. That's why we have to focus on Tyrell." Lauren's response was firm. "He knows more than he's admitting. We just need to get him to talk." Emily hesitated, brow furrowing. "And if he doesn't talk?" Lauren leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Then we find another way. Someone in his crew knows something. The bearded guy is one of the younger ones. They're the ones who break first, not their leaders." The next morning, Lauren met Carter at the police station. The air was thick with tension, the faint ring of phones and whispered conversations adding to the oppressive atmosphere. Carter led her down a quiet hallway, stopping in front of an interrogation room door. "Tyrell's in there," Carter said, nodding toward the window in the door. "He hasn't said much since last night, just playing tough." Lauren crossed her arms, her gaze resolute. "Let me talk to him." Carter hesitated, his face wary. "Are you sure? He's the kind of guy who'll dig into your pain." Lauren didn't look away, her voice steady. "Let him try." Carter opened the door, and Lauren stepped inside. Tyrell sat opposite her, his muscular frame hunched, leaning back in his chair. His hands were cuffed, but his face still wore a look of challenge. He looked up when he saw her, a sneer tugging at his lips. "Oh, if it isn't Wonder Woman," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Did they send you in here to finish what you started?" Lauren pulled up a chair and sat across from Tyrell, her posture relaxed but her gaze sharp. "You're in big trouble, Tyrell." He sneered, a hollow sound escaping his lips. "Trouble? Oh, sweetheart, this is just a hiccup. I'll be out of here before you finish your coffee." "Not this time," Lauren replied, her tone deep and resolute. "Your crew's falling apart. The guy with the patchy beard's already singing like a bird, the younger ones are terrified. It's just a matter of time before they spill everything we need." Tyrell's smile faltered, a brief flicker of uncertainty crossing his face before he leaned forward. "You're bluffing." "Try me," Lauren said, her eyes unwavering. "You think you're the only one who can read people? You're not invincible, no matter how much you think you are." Tyrell's jaw clenched, the cracks in his confidence beginning to show. Lauren pressed on, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "We know about the other groups, the other gangs operating in the area. We know you're tied to something bigger. But you're just a small fish. The people above you? They won't care about you when you're no longer useful. They'll toss you aside." Tyrell's hand balled into a fist, frustration boiling up. "You don't know anything." Lauren leaned in, her voice soft but powerful. "I do know. And if you're smart, you'll start talking because the people you're protecting? They won't protect you." The door opened, and Carter stepped in, holding a file. He set it down on the table, flipping it open. Photos and reports about Tyrell's crew spread across the surface. He slid one photo across to Lauren. It was surveillance footage of Tyrell with a man Lauren didn't recognize. "Is this your boss?" Lauren asked, nodding toward the photo. "The one pulling the strings? What's his name?" Tyrell glared at the photo, his teeth grinding as he struggled to keep his composure. Silence hung thick in the air until, finally, he slouched back in his chair. "You won't understand," he muttered bitterly. "Even if I tell you, it won't matter. He's untouchable." Lauren narrowed her eyes, her voice steely. "We'll take care of that." Tyrell hesitated, his gaze flickering between Lauren and Carter. For the first time, his mask of bravado shattered completely. "His name's Ethan. Ethan Wallace. He's the one running everything." Lauren and Carter exchanged a look, her eyes hardening. They had a name, but the work was far from over. Later, when Lauren and Emily met at the coffee shop, Tyrell's revelation still hung between them like an unresolved question. "Who's Ethan Wallace?" Emily asked, her fingers flying over the tablet screen. "He's a businessman," Emily replied, her voice laced with skepticism. "Owns a few construction companies, clean on the surface." Lauren frowned, leaning over to examine the screen. "And what's beneath the surface?" "Not as clean as it looks," Emily said, scrolling through more information. "A few shell companies, connections to underground political groups. He's sophisticated, but there are traces." Lauren's mind raced. Wallace was the link they needed, but he wouldn't be easy to bring down. She looked at Emily, her gaze resolute. "Then we'll make him talk." In the bustling conference room at the precinct, the cold walls were now covered with printouts, photos, and maps, all connected by bright red strings stretching across the bulletin board. Ethan Wallace's name stood out in the center, circled in thick black marker. Officers moved around, reviewing files and cross-checking notes, but Lauren's focus remained solely on Carter, who was standing by the board, presenting to a small group. "This is the tough part," Carter said, pointing to a cluster of pins marking Wallace's companies. "On paper he's clean. All his activities are legal, at least the ones we can verify. But thanks to Tyrell's testimony and Lauren's intel, we have enough reason to believe he's using these construction companies as fronts to fund and coordinate these hate groups." Emily, sitting off to the side with her laptop, raised her hand. "I've found some unusual financial activity tied to Wallace's shell companies, moving money around, making donations to political organizations with ties to extremist groups. It's sophisticated, but it's there." Carter nodded, his jaw tightening. "Sophisticated isn't enough for a warrant. We need something more concrete. Bank statements, communications, anything that directly links Wallace to these groups." Lauren folded her arms, her expression grim. "What about the crew we just arrested? Tyrell gave us Wallace's name. The guy with the beard and the others, they know something. They're scared. Carter acknowledged it with a hard look. The idea of turning on Wallace scares them. They know how dangerous he is. Lauren stepped forward, her tone unwavering. Then we need to push harder. Wallace won't stop unless we. Policies, laws that benefit them. We're just the foot soldiers. Lauren's stomach twisted, but she kept her face neutral. So where's the funding coming from? How does it work? The thin-bearded man lowered his head, his voice barely audible. He launders money through construction companies. Sends it into shell accounts, then it gets funneled to the gangs. We get our cut for the dirty work. Carter, who had been observing from behind the one-way glass, entered the room with a file in hand. That's enough to start connecting the dots, he said, placing the file on the table. But we'll need you to testify. The thin-bearded man froze, his eyes wide with panic. Testify? Are you crazy? Ethan will have me killed. Not if we take him down first, Lauren said resolutely. Help us and we'll protect you. In the conference room, Lauren and Carter reviewed the new information with Emily. The financial trail the thin-bearded man described matched what Emily had uncovered, providing a clearer picture of Wallace's operations. This is the breakthrough we needed, Emily said, her fingers flying over the keyboard. We can trace the money directly to Tyrell's group and several others operating in nearby districts. With the paper trail and Tyrell's testimony, we've got enough to get a search warrant. Carter nodded, his face set. I'll get the paperwork done. Once we have the warrant, we hit Wallace's main office. Lauren clenched her jaw, her voice heavy. It's not just about catching him. We need to dismantle everything. The network, the funding, his influence. If we don't, someone else will. Step in. Emily placed her hand gently on Lauren's arm, her gaze soft. One step at a time. Taking down Wallace is the first step. The search warrant was approved quicker than expected. That evening, Lauren stood with Carter and a team of officers outside Wallace's sleek office building, the gleaming glass facade a stark contrast to the corruption hidden within. The team worked quickly, entering the building and securing the area. Lauren stood still, watching as the officers rifled through files, computers, and desk drawers. Emily was also involved in the operation, observing, taking photographs, and making notes for her later investigative report. Carter emerged from one of the offices, a thick stack of files in hand, his face triumphant. Here we go, he said, holding the files aloft. Transaction records, emails, it's all here. Wallace is done. Lauren allowed herself a brief, satisfied smile, but she knew the battle wasn't over. Catching Wallace was just the beginning of dismantling the network he'd built. Lauren sat in the dimly lit conference room at the police station, a city map spread out before her with red and green pins marking locations tied to incidents over the past year. Parks, alleyways, and small businesses were all within areas targeted by Tyrell's groups and similar organizations. Across from her, Officer Carter flipped through a stack of files, his brows furrowed in concentration. This is bigger than we thought, Carter said, sliding one of the files toward Lauren. Wallace has been involved in all these cases, but always indirectly, donating to shady organizations, funding businesses that suddenly went bankrupt after trouble in their areas. He's careful, covering his tracks. Lauren leaned over the map, her eyes narrowing as she traced the connections. Careful doesn't mean untouchable. He's left a trail, it's just a matter of piecing it all together. Emily stepped into the room, laptop in hand, her gaze resolute. I've dug into Wallace's financials, she said, setting the laptop on the table and swiveling it toward them. He's moving money through a chain of shell companies. On paper, it all looks legitimate, construction firms, consulting, community development, but the timing of these transactions coincides with when the incident started. He's funneling money to these groups under the guise of donations. Carter frowned, flipping through the documents. If we can prove that the money is being used to fund hate groups, it could be a federal case, but we need more than just suspicion. Lauren leaned back, her mind working quickly. Then we target the people in his network. Tyrell might not know much beyond the orders he gets, but someone in Wallace's circle does. He isn't doing this alone. Emily nodded, her fingers rapidly typing on the keyboard. If we can find out who's handling logistics, moving the money, or attending meetings, it might give us the break we need. Later that evening, Lauren and Carter sat in an unmarked car, parked outside a nondescript office building downtown. The fluorescent lights spilled out onto the sidewalk, casting long shadows down the empty street. Emily's intel had pointed them here. This building could very well be Wallace's operational hub, a front for his network. "We don't go in without backup," Carter said, his voice firm. Lauren didn't take her eyes off the building. "We don't go in yet. Not until it's time. We watch, gather intel, and follow anyone who seems important." Carter shot her a skeptical glance. "You really think someone's going to lead us straight to Wallace?" "There's always someone who slips up," Lauren replied, her voice steady. "Everyone makes mistakes eventually." The hours passed. In silence as they kept watch, their patience rewarded when a shiny black SUV pulled up to the entrance. A well-dressed man in his mid-40s stepped out, glancing around nervously before heading into the building. Lauren squinted. "That's Jason Cole," she said, recognizing him from one of Emily's reports. "He's one of Wallace's key players, handling the finances." Carter grabbed the radio, his voice decisive. "We follow him when he leaves. If he meets with Wallace, we'll know." The surveillance led them to an upscale restaurant on the other side of the city. Lauren and Carter observed from a distance as Cole entered and was warmly greeted by a man in a tailored suit, none other than Ethan Wallace. The two of them sat at a private table in the back, their conversation obscured by thick glass and a private curtain. "We've got him," Lauren whispered. Carter nodded, quickly contacting their team through the radio to coordinate the surveillance. "We'll have both audio and video. If they discuss anything criminal, we'll have the evidence." Hours later, at the precinct, the recordings from the restaurant played on the screen. Wallace's calm, controlled voice contrasted sharply with the criminal nature of his words. "We need to keep up the pressure in those areas," Wallace said, his tone cold. "If they feel unsafe, they'll leave. And when they're gone, we move in. Cheap land, big profits." Kane's voice was low, no less menacing. "What about the guys in the group? They're getting reckless." Wallace's reply was sharp, his tone cutting. "Replace them. They're just tools used for the job. As long as they do their part, I don't care what happens to them." The room fell silent as the recording ended. Carter turned to Lauren, his expression grim. "That's enough. We can bring him in now." Lauren stared at the screen, her voice resolute. "Enough to end this." Lauren stood in the operations room of the precinct, arms crossed as Carter and Emily spread out the documents and photos they had gathered. The name Ethan Wallace loomed like a dark cloud over everything. Carter had retrieved Wallace's file the previous night, and the picture painted was deeply troubling. A respected businessman on the outside, but with ties to extremist groups that couldn't be ignored. "We've got quite a bit of circumstantial evidence," Carter said, pointing to the photos on the table. "Connections to outlaw groups, suspicious payments through his shell companies, but nothing solid enough to lock him down." Emily added, her gaze sharp, "Everything about his public image screams respectability, charitable donations, community projects, a spotless record. But these payments, they're too clean, like someone's trying to hide something." Lauren leaned forward, her eyes scanning the materials quickly, her finger tracing a line over the financial reports. "These payments, they're too regular. Same amounts, same times. This isn't charity, it's funding." Emily nodded, her eyes narrowing. "And guess where the money's going? Small organizations, vague descriptions, community initiatives, local improvement groups, it's all dead ends." "But not for us," Lauren replied, her voice steady. "We've linked him to Tyrell's group. If we dig deeper, we'll find connections to other gangs." Carter sighed, rubbing his neck, his face etched with concern. "We need more than suspicious payments and rumors. We need testimony, direct evidence tying him to hate crimes." Lauren clenched her teeth, her voice full of resolve. "Then we pressure Tyrell. He's already talked once. If we push harder, he'll give us more information." Carter shook his head. "Tyrell's scared, but he's also loyal. He won't fold easily." "Loyalty has its limits," Lauren said, her gaze cold. He knows Wallace won't protect him. He's a liability now. The interrogation room was colder than ever, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead creating an eerie stillness. Lauren and Carter faced Tyrell once again. This time, he looked more exhausted, the weight of his situation pressing down on his broad shoulders. The defiance in his eyes had faded, replaced by calculating caution. Lauren set a file on the table, pushing it toward him. Inside were photos and reports, similar to what Carter had shown her earlier. But now, a new page was on top, the arrest report for one of Tyrell's younger crew members. Your kid spilled everything, Lauren said flatly. He gave us everything we need to link you to Wallace. Tyrell's lips pressed into a thin line, his hands clenching on the table. He's lying, Tyrell muttered under his breath. Lauren didn't blink. Are you sure about that? Because if you're the last one left, you're the one who'll pay the price. Wallace isn't coming for you. You know that. Carter leaned forward, his tone soft but firm. Help us build the case against Wallace and you still have a shot. Don't, and you'll be facing a laundry list of charges that will bury you. Tyrell's jaw twitched, the muscles in his face twitching as he wrestled with the decision. The silence dragged on, heavy and suffocating, until finally he exhaled a long breath. Fine, he muttered. What do you need to know? Lauren's gaze sharpened, never leaving him. Everything. How he's funding you, how he's communicating, the other groups he's linked to. Spill it, or you'll be left holding nothing. Tyrell hesitated before reluctantly nodding. His voice dropped as he spoke. It all goes through his companies, mostly construction firms. He launders money through contracts, pays us through shells. We have to keep it quiet, but sometimes things get messy. Lauren's gaze never wavered. Other groups. Tyrell hesitated again, then nodded. Yeah, a few groups. Same structure. We don't work directly together, but we all know the to keep everyone scared, keep them out of his territory. Carter jotted down notes, his pen scratching against the paper as he wrote quickly. Lauren didn't look away from Tyrell. How does he contact you? Through intermediaries, Tyrell answered. The guys handle the money and relay orders. I've met Wallace maybe twice. He doesn't like getting involved directly. Who are these guys? Lauren pressed. Tyrell rattled off a list of names and locations, each one adding weight to their case. When he finished, Carter looked up, his face grim but determined. That's enough to get started, Carter said. We'll cross-check everything. If it checks out, we'll take him down. Tyrell slumped back in his chair, drained. You think this is over? Wallace has people everywhere. You won't touch him. Lauren stood up, her expression cold. Watch me. Back in the operations room, Lauren and Emily reviewed the information Tyrell had provided. Wallace's intermediaries gave them a clear path to follow, and Carter had already mobilized teams to track them. The net was tightening, and the once untouchable figure of Wallace was beginning to crack. We're getting close, Emily said, her voice a mix of fatigue and resolve. We're finally making progress. Lauren nodded, her gaze unwavering. He's not untouchable. He's just playing the system, and now we're going to break it. Lauren sat in the crowded meeting room at the precinct, the atmosphere heavy with a mix of exhaustion and determination. The table was covered in papers, photos, and notes, all pointing to one name, Ethan Wallace. The evidence gathered by Carter's team over the past week painted a damning picture, but Lauren knew the hard part was just beginning. Carter stood at the front of the room, addressing a team of police officers, prosecutors, and investigators. Wallace's network has been meticulously constructed to evade detection, but we've finally gathered enough evidence to build the case, thanks to Tyrell's cooperation. We have names, payment trails, and testimonies linking him to several hate groups operating in the area. A sharp-eyed prosecutor, Mitchell, flipped through the files in front of her. We need to make sure all of this holds up. Wallace has extensive connections, and his lawyers will argue that none of this directly links him to the crimes. Tyrell's testimony is the key, Carter responded, his voice firm. He can place Wallace in the room and tie him to the payments funding these groups. That's if he doesn't crack on the stand, Mitchell said, her tone skeptical. We've all seen this before. The defense lawyers will tear him apart if they sense any weakness. Lauren leaned forward, sitting on the edge of the table. Tyrell knows what he's up against, she said, her voice even but resolute. He's scared, and rightfully so, but he also knows Wallace has abandoned him. That betrayal is enough to keep him talking. Mitchell nodded, though her expression remained cautious. Even so, we need more than his word. We need to establish an undeniable, direct link between Wallace and these crimes. Emily, sitting beside Lauren with her laptop open, spoke up. We have financial records showing money flowing from Wallace's companies through shell accounts tied to Tyrell's group and other similar ones. These accounts directly link to payments for materials used in their operations, from flyers and spray paint for graffiti to weapons in some cases. Lauren added, not taking her eyes off the documents, not to mention the communication records. Tyrell's group uses burner phones, but some of the numbers connect to Wallace's associates. It's a pattern, one Wallace can't explain away. Carter nodded, his voice confident. This is not just a hate crime case. This is a case about dismantling a network of terrorism and violence. If we play it right, we'll send a message that these kinds of operations won't remain undetected or unpunished. The days that followed were a blur of frantic preparations. Lauren worked tirelessly with her team, piecing together the events in Wallace's schedule. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became. Wallace was the head of a vast network that had instilled fear in the community for years. Emily spent hours analyzing Wallace's public image, combing through speeches and interviews he'd given, searching for any underlying statements that hinted at his beliefs. He's very careful, Emily said, flipping through a video of Wallace speaking at a business conference. He never says anything overtly, but he uses language that the groups he funds understand, like protecting community integrity or restoring tradition. It's coded language. Not enough to convict, Mitchell spoke up in a late meeting, but enough to indicate intent when combined with everything else. Lauren kept her focus on the materials in front of her, her concentration unwavering. Tyrell's testimony will be crucial, but we also have bank records, intercepted communications, and paperwork trail that leads straight to Wallace's desk. The evidence is overwhelming, but I know Wallace's legal team will exploit any weaknesses they can find. The night before the trial, Lauren found herself alone in the precinct, staring at the whiteboard covered in photos and notes. Wallace's face glared back at her, his arrogant smile a reminder of the power he held. She thought of the victims, the neighborhoods Tyrell's group had terrorized, the communities Wallace had sought to control through fear. For her, this case was not just about personal justice. It was justice for all of them. Carter walked into the room, breaking her train of thought. You've done a lot to get us here, Tate. I hope you know that. Lauren didn't look away from the board. Not enough. Not until he's behind bars. Carter leaned against the doorframe, his gaze determined. The prosecutors are ready. Emily's work on the finances has filled in many of the gaps, and Tyrell, he's scared. Scared, but he knows this is his only chance to save himself. Lauren finally turned to face him. Do you think that will be enough? Carter's expression never wavered. It has to be. The next day, the trial began. The courtroom was packed, the tension thick in the air, and every small noise seemed to make the space hold its breath. Wallace sat at the defense table, dressed in a pricey suit, exuding calm and confidence. Yet Lauren could still sense the underlying tension, his clenched jaw, the brief glance he shot at his legal team as the prosecution began to present its case. Tyrell's testimony was the turning point. Though he seemed nervous, his words were clear and damning. He detailed the payments, the orders, and the quiet understanding that Wallace was the one in charge. The defense attorneys tried to discredit Tyrell, pointing to his criminal record and plea deal. But the prosecution countered with a mountain of evidence, confirming every detail Tyrell had given. At the end of the first day, it was clear that the case had strength, but Lauren knew the battle was far from over. The atmosphere in the courtroom remained heavy, a silence hanging in the air that made every rustle of paper and quiet breath seem amplified. Lauren sat at the back, arms crossed, eyes glued to the unfolding events on the final day of the trial. Emily sat next to her, pen in hand, but it hadn't moved in what seemed like forever. All eyes were on the defense team as Wallace's lawyer began his closing argument. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the lawyer spoke, his voice smooth and confident. "My client is a respected businessman, a pillar of this community. The prosecution wants you to believe that he is the leader of a criminal network based solely on the testimony of a desperate man trying to save himself." He pointed toward Tyrell, who was hunched over at the witness table, avoiding eye contact with the room. "Is this the man you are going to trust to build a case against Ethan Wallace? A man with multiple charges against him, cooperating with the police only to save his own skin. Is this the kind of testimony you will rely on to make your decision?" Lauren gritted her teeth as the lawyer continued to pick apart every minor flaw in the prosecution's case. He was too good. Too good. She glanced at Emily, who was frantically scribbling notes, the frustration clear in her eyes. Finally, the defense finished its closing argument. Mitchell, the prosecutor, stood to rebut. Her voice was clear, her words precise as she stepped forward to address the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the defense wants you to believe that Ethan Wallace is an innocent businessman caught in a web of misunderstandings, but the evidence we've presented shows a completely different story." She turned to face the jury, her gaze unwavering. "We've shown you the financial records from Wallace's company, proving his funding of hate groups. We've provided communication logs showing his associates were involved in planning and carrying out acts of violence. And we've heard testimony from someone who has been deeply embedded in this network, someone with everything to lose by coming forward." Mitchell paused, letting her words sink in. "Hatred doesn't always wear a mask, and it doesn't always carry a weapon. Sometimes, it hides behind a suit and a slick smile. But don't be fooled, Ethan Wallace is the orchestrator of this network of fear and intimidation, and today, you have the power to bring him to justice." She sat down, her gaze steady as the judge instructed the jury to begin deliberations. The wait was unbearable, a nightmare of anticipation. The hours dragged on as Lauren paced the courthouse hallway, her mind racing over every piece of evidence, every moment of the trial. Emily leaned against the wall, arms crossed, her worried eyes following Lauren. "You've done everything you could," Emily said softly. "It's not in your hands anymore." Lauren didn't respond. She knew Emily was right, but the waiting still gnawed at her. Finally, a police officer entered the hall. "The jury has reached a verdict," he said. Lauren and Emily exchanged a glance before following the crowd back into the courtroom. The room was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Wallace sat at the defense table, his face unreadable, but Lauren could see the tension in his eyes as the jury filed in. The foreperson stood, a piece of paper in hand. The judge spoke. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor," the foreperson replied. The courtroom fell silent as the foreperson began to read the decision. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit a hate crime, we find the defendant, Ethan Wallace, guilty. On the charge of funding and organizing criminal networks, we find the defendant, Ethan Wallace, guilty." The words echoed throughout the courtroom, and in that moment, everything fell into silence. A murmur followed, a gentle wave of relief mixed with tension that began to rise. At last, Wallace's calm facade shattered. His face contorted, and the anger he could no longer conceal was evident. The judge began to speak on the verdict. Outside the courthouse, Lauren stood on the steps, the cold afternoon air sharpening her senses while reporters crowded around the building. Emily approached, a small smile playing on her lips. "You did it," Emily said. "He'll face justice." Lauren didn't smile, though the weight on her shoulders was lighter. This was just one battle. There were many like him out there, and she would have to confront them. "But for now, this is a victory," Emily said with resolve. Carter appeared, his face tired but satisfied. "They're recommending the maximum sentence. Wallace will never see the light outside a prison cell for a long time." Lauren nodded. "That's where he belongs." As the crowd buzzed around them, Lauren took a brief moment to feel a sense of contentment. Justice had been served, but she knew her work wasn't finished. The fight against hatred never truly ends, but today, they had made progress. The atmosphere seemed lighter, though the weight of everything still pressed down on her chest. Ethan Wallace was going to prison. His empire, built on fear and hatred, had been shattered piece by piece. But Lauren knew the battle was far from over. Emily moved closer, handing her a cup of coffee. "You should be proud of this. You took them down." Lauren took a sip, letting the warmth spread, easing the pain from the confrontation earlier. "This is just the beginning. But this is bigger than Wallace. There are many like him, people who think they can hide behind money and power, controlling things from the shadows." Emily nodded, her expression thoughtful. "At least Tyrell and his crew aren't out there anymore, and they've helped us dismantle the entire network." Lauren clenched her jaw thinking of Tyrell's gang. The scruffy beards and youthful faces now faced their own punishments, though their cooperation with authorities had earned them reduced sentences. Tyrell, in particular, had played a key role in exposing Wallace's network, though Lauren knew it was out of self-preservation, not remorse. "They'll pay for what they've done," Lauren said calmly. "Maybe. Not as much as they deserve, but they chose to help, and at that moment, they helped the entire case." "Do you think they'll change?" Emily asked uncertainly. Lauren shook her head. "Not my concern. My job is to make sure people like them can't hurt anyone else. And right now they can't." Just then, Carter approached, holding a stack of documents. His weary face softened as he stopped beside them. "The sentencing for Tyrell's gang is scheduled for next month. Tyrell will get at least 10 years, and the others will get 5 to 7 years, depending on how much they cooperate with the court." Lauren nodded, her lips pressed into a firm line. "Enough to keep them from harming anyone for a while." Carter shifted uncomfortably. "It's not perfect, but their testimony was the key to bringing down Wallace. Without it, he'd still be walking free." Lauren didn't respond immediately. She knew Carter was right, but that didn't make the reality of their lenient sentences any easier to accept. Still, Wallace's conviction was the bigger win. It wasn't just about one man. It was a message to all those who thought they could use fear and violence to control others. That evening, Lauren sat on the bench in the park where everything had started. The bruises on her side had faded, but the memories of that day were still fresh. She thought about the gang that had ambushed her, their words, and the hatred driving their actions. They had underestimated her, just as so many others had before, and that had sealed their fate. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the light waned, and long shadows stretched across the park. Lauren stood up. Her work wasn't over, but this time, after many long weeks, she allowed herself a breath. Justice had been served, and for now, that was enough. Lauren's story wasn't just about the pursuit of justice, it was a powerful reminder that anyone can make a difference. Have you ever faced injustice or stood up for what's right, knowing it wasn't easy? Share your story in the comments. Who knows, it might empower and inspire someone else. If you found this story meaningful, don't hesitate to share it with friends and family to spread the message of courage and resilience. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe to receive the latest updates. The stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared with the intention of spreading human values in life and have been rewritten with the support of AI. If there are any mistakes, kindly overlook them with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.